Process of human beings gathering up facts and finding ways to get them to community and to people in ways that they can understand. Most of the gathering up of facts today, and increasingly so, is not happening, through a process led by individual people. It's through sensors in the form of social media networks, sensors in the form of physical hardware sensors that are gathering up that information to power the services that we're using, to power governments and other administrative agencies that are running our lives. And so we've got a wonderful group, I think, to help us understand that present, that future, and how we really can put that information to work in practical ways in communities. So just directly to my right is Chaya Nayak. She's a public policy researcher, a research manager at a tech startup called Facebook, and has previously led Facebook's Data for Good initiative, and is currently working on a project that's thinking even more expansively about the role of social media data to inform decision making. Next to her is Aaron Wren, who's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and has thought on both the public and private side about the role of technology and governance. Paulette Brown-Hines is the publisher of Black Voice News and also the founder of Voice Media Ventures. And then on the end is Josh McManus, who's very hard to describe, but is currently working at the highest levels with Ford Motor Company around some of their work on automated vehicles and the future of driving, but has spent a lot of his career thinking about what the future of community can look like. So thank you all for joining us. Paulette, I want to start with you because you're doing something incredibly practical, which is you are leading an organization that's doing the human gathering of facts that we call journalism, and you're also trying to take advantage of the other kinds of data that are available to inform communities. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the mapping project that you're doing and how it came about? Why, as journalists, you wanted to take on that project?
Yes. Thank you, Sam. And I spoke about this project actually in the fall at the Smart Cities, Night Smart Cities Forum in Philadelphia. I am a publisher of a legacy newspaper. We still publish print copies weekly of the Black Voice News based in Riverside, California, which is Southern California. It is a 47-year-old publication founded by students at our local university in the 70s and then made its way into the community. My parents became the publishers and owners of that paper over 35 years ago. So I've grown up with the paper, and then I am second generation publisher and charged with stewarding that legacy. And I'm doing that in a time when we have all of this technology and changes, just dramatic changes. And for me, as a publisher, there's a sense of urgency. There's the print dollars are drying up. Digital, they call digital dimes. I recently received a check for some digital ads that ran that was missing at least 2 zeros. And so the money is not there in terms of print to digital advertising. And for me, as a second generation publisher who doesn't want to lose a publication that's very important in our community on my watch, there is that sense of urgency. And I've been excited about new technologies, but I became extremely excited about GIS and digital mapping. And there's some great work that's being done at the national level with media organizations, but I didn't see it necessarily at the local level. And so a lot of the expertise is not there at a community newspapers. But I ended up meeting Jack Dangerman, who is the founder of Esri, one of the global leader in digital mapping, who happens to be located in my region. And I became so excited when my team started developing story maps using their technology. And I started seeing the possibilities of what we can do to better tell our stories. And as I explored more and learned more about some of the new platforms like the GeoHub, I became even more excited because I saw that technology as what a community newspaper is, but digital. It engages the community, you can create initiatives, you could have conversations around data. And so I ended up developing my mapping project as kind of a community mapping framework. We put in a community mapping framework. And we brought together my team, which are graphic artists and writers, reporters, but then we've expanded it to the larger community. So we have individuals who work with nonprofits who are working with African American students who are now incorporating GIS into their curriculum. We work with actually one of our local special collections archivists who is doing some digital humanities mapping. And then we work with our higher education leaders who are now helping us better tell that story. So we're finding partnerships and collaborations through that work.
How is the audience responding?
Oh, it's been great. It's been great. I mean, I'm also on my community foundation board. I know there's some community foundations here, and I actually set up a fund to fund some of the work. So I've had great funders. I've actually had supporters from the community, kind of local funders, who've helped fund some of the work we're doing. It's only a little over, we're in our second year of working on it, but we've had tremendous support from the local community.
So Chaya, I want to talk to you a little bit. You know, Facebook is not a newspaper, is not a media publication, as they often remind us, and when controversy erupts. But there was an intuition from fairly early on that the ability not only to ingest data but to visualize it and to engage people around it was important to the company. Can you tell us a little bit about what drove that insight that there ought to be a Data for Good initiative, and then how you all made decisions about how to put that capability to work for different kinds of communities?
Yes, I'm happy to. So Data for Good is an initiative at Facebook where we're working on figuring out how do we basically take Facebook data that we're getting from the community of sensors that we have through our users and actually leverage that data to do good in the world. And really it came from this idea that, of course, all of this data is being poured into our products, it's informing ads, it's informing the news feed, it's informing Marketplace and all of these other tools that users use when they go to Facebook. But at the same time, that data is actually really important to understand the world more broadly and could really be used for community good and for social good. And so 3 years ago, we really started to think about how can we better engage with the broader community to start to think about how to build data for good products. And we brought a group of community leaders together at Facebook, and we started to tell them a little bit about the data sets that we collected, what they looked like, and how we could actually take those data sets and figure out ways to build products through the data. And the first thing that we came up with was Facebook has a very rich set of geolocation data. Of course, people have mobile phones. They carry those mobile phones wherever they go. And if users have location history or location services turned on, we do get information about their general location. Now, of course, that's scary. Geolocation data is scary. But put in the right hands and in aggregated and privacy-preserving forms, it could also be extremely impactful to local communities. And so the first product that we built a couple of years ago was called Disaster Maps. And essentially Disaster Maps is a partnership with organizations like UNICEF, Net Hope, the Red Cross, and the World Food Program to give them maps during disasters so that they can use our geolocation data for situational awareness on the ground. Now, just to give you an example that actually I think connects well to Paulette's example is during Hurricane Maria a couple years ago in Puerto Rico and in Dominica and other Caribbean islands, we actually saw the first time where our disaster maps were used on the ground to help a local community. We partnered with an organization called Net Hope, which does connectivity services after a disaster. And what they were able to do was use our maps to understand where communities lost connectivity and could no longer connect or talk to each other. And one of the things that they've heard from people on the ground is that the inability to call friends and family is just devastating. Before they want food, before they want water, they want to let their friends and family know that they're okay and that they're safe. And yet communities were unable to do this and were trying to just travel across the country on foot, trying to figure out how to get to their family members. So one thing that they actually did was once NetHope got a van out to these neighborhoods so that they could get Wi-Fi back on, what we saw was NetHope form groups of community leaders across the island who were actually contributing information on Facebook groups. They were using the disaster maps to go actually out into the community to identify populations, and then working with those populations to get messages around what was happening in the community to recover and rebuild. And so from there, we've been working on expanding disaster maps. We're hoping to get into areas like health because we think there's value there. And really, we're just listening to what community leaders tell us would be valuable, partnering with them to figure out how to actually build these data products, and then moving from there to give them something that might be helpful, or we hope will be helpful in their communities.
What is a community need? What's the capability a community and organization needs to actually be able to talk to you guys in a way that can lead to a useful product? What are the kinds of things you need to know? What are the kinds of skills that have to be present?
In terms of skills, it varies. So with Data for Good, what we're working on doing is pairing Facebook data scientists, Facebook engineers, and Facebook policy leaders with community leaders who just have a vision for how data can be valuable in their communities. And so when we built disaster maps, a bunch of community organizations like the Red Cross came to us and said, we think that this data can help us do X, Y, and Z, and here's the impact that it will have. And really, that's all we needed because we had the internal kind of skill sets to be able to actually produce the data sets. Now, I want to caveat that heavily because we know that just because we can run a bunch of data algorithms and build data products, it doesn't mean that that data is actually valuable. So the second thing that we need is we need a group of community leaders who invested in telling us whether the product is informing the right thing, whether it's the right form of data, and whether they can actually use that in their operational decision making. Because if they can't, then everything that we're building is useless.
So, Aaron, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about, you write a lot about some of the governance questions for the different services that are entering communities. And a huge number of these services are going to be based on ingesting new kinds of data, like autonomous vehicles. Can you just give us a sense of sort of where the world's going in terms of the kind of data that's going to start being collected to power services or governance in community?
Yeah, well, I love the fact that our panel was entitled Smarter Cities because like AI, smart cities was a buzzword that is thrown around a lot, and it's been talked about a long time. We've seen that technology has disrupted many industries and many business areas, and the thinking is, hey, technology is going to get applied to the city, to the business of the city, and it's going to dramatically transform how we live for the better. And it went through I see it's going through several generations of that. The first one started off with big enterprise software vendors like Cisco or Ericsson or Siemens selling cities technology to do things like monitor their water systems. And there's a lot of very important things that happened with that. But ultimately, I don't think that's what people were really thinking about because that's not how that doesn't necessarily affect the way people live their lives. It's sort of a back-end, back-office type process. And then the second generation of that, which gets in more to the data, was, I think, the open data movement. This idea that the government's going to take all this data and is going to put it up on the web, and that's going to enable app developers to work with this data. It's going to enable journalists to work with this data, and it's really going to enable transformational ways in engaging with the city. And immediately, we did actually see one of those come to fruition, and it was the bus tracker app, the when is my bus coming? That became an immediate killer app. But the reality is that not a lot came out of that, particularly at first. I remember when data.gov launched, and it was just page after page after page of raw files, and it's like, what do I do with this? And in fact, that's one of the ways that I got my start. I come from a technology background. I was with Accenture before I went into public policy, and I was able to build my own database. So when the governments would drop these files, I could actually figure out how to process them, query them, import them. And so when Census 2010, when the Census Bureau was releasing their data files state by state, I was able to respond and much more quickly than others have maps and analysis up because I knew how to process all that data. Well, today, I think that the good news is the journalism community has become much, much more sophisticated in data processing, analysis, visualization, et cetera. But that still didn't transform kind of the way that we lived. And then we came into the third wave of smart cities, which is most relevant here, which is consumer-based companies, consumer internet type companies started providing new forms of services. Uber, for example, is a quintessential smart cities app. It changed how people get around in cities. Airbnb would be an example of that. Google Maps would be an example. The smartphone here, my iPhone, is essentially a smart city app. Instacart, all the delivery services, Amazon Prime Now, everything that you access that changes how you live is now marrying technology to new services. You could also think about things like WeWork, for example, changing the way that we consume office space. And so it's really these consumer companies coming into this space. Autonomous vehicles, when they're deployed, are going to be a perfect example of this, are the ones that are delivering new things that are really radically transforming how we live. And there's a lot of ways that we can think about these companies and what they do. But I think from a journalism perspective, one of the best way to think about a lot of them is as governments, as privately owned governments, essentially. Uber is not just a service that provides transportation. Uber is essentially its own taxi and limousine commission. It establishes the rules under which the marketplace for its services take place. Facebook is a government. It makes laws. It has a tip line that you can report people who break the laws. It's got its own investigators. It's got its own judges who can impose penalties, including essentially the death penalty of kicking you off the platform. It has an appeals process, all built into its system. Apple even has a tax system built into its iPhone that if you want to sell something on the iPhone, Apple gets a cut of it. And so I think about that from a journalism perspective in a couple ways. One is you have reporters covering City Hall, you have reporters covering the State House. Do you have a reporter covering Facebook or covering Uber or covering YouTube, as we talked earlier? These things should be seen as essentially essentially the providers, the governance and the providers of services that we depend on. And a lot of the data that is being produced that is highly relevant to, for example, congestion on our streets is actually produced by these applications off of their smartphone apps and is proprietary to them. So there are no public meeting notices, there are no FOIA requirements. And so I think we're still sorting out what that means from a public engagement perspective, and that there is a public interest in some of this data. I think what you just described with Facebook for Good is really part of that. Many of these companies are opening up their data. Governments are kind of negotiating to get access to data. But I think ultimately thinking about the sources of data and the providers of the services that people are increasingly essentially living by in cities are coming out of these apps. And then maybe the second implication of viewing these companies as governments is also that we should realize that running a government is hard, right? I mean, so we can think about how hard it is to make the subways run on time in Chicago, or in New York, excuse me, where I'm from. And it's like, yeah, we're having big transport problems and it's easy to sit on the sidelines and throw stones, but it's actually a hard business to be in. I think as those of you who've covered government for a long time know. So we should just expect that this is going to be difficult, and we're in this establishment phase of kind of what the rules of the road are.
So I think, Josh, maybe welcome us into the point of view of one of those kind of quote unquote governments, which is, I know you're helping Ford think about these bigger questions, that it's not just about we're building a thing that can move people from place to place, but we're a company that's going to build infrastructure, services on top of that infrastructure, and data collection on top of those services that improve our lives. Can you tell us a little bit about how you guys are thinking about this at Ford, and then maybe answer the hard question of how do we have a say? If the government's Ford and they're reimagining our city, how should we react to the proposition Aaron's providing? How do we have a say in what that community looks like?
Sure. My long read of history is that we as mice always figure out the maze. And so I actually see us sort of at this intersection right now where our systemic OS is a little out of date. And our technology is moving a lot faster than even our industry and definitely our society. And so for me, and I speak on behalf of me, and Ford's a client and a lot of other great folks are clients, but from my perspective and thinking through the lens of like my 5-year-old son and how I'm trying to counsel others on his behalf is that these old binaries that we've held are just not working for us. So for-profit versus nonprofit, it's just not working for us. And you see this advancing from both sides of the political aisle right now. One side you've got Warren Buffett and Donald Trump saying we should maybe stop being quarterly and be biannual in our reporting. And on the other side, you've got Elizabeth Warren saying we need an Accountable Corporations Act. They at least agree on the problem, which is the OS is broken. And so I think that we're rapidly moving to a place where companies have to, and this is why I call my work for purpose, we have to move from for-profit to for-purpose. And I don't disagree with Aaron's point that these entities have become their own sort of governments. They defy a descriptor that currently exists. In the old world, for a company that was a motor company like Ford, you made a product, you made a Model T, and you threw it out into the world, and then there was an entity called the government, and they had to figure out, like, should we build a road? Should we put up a red light? And that was the friction between the two, and it's done us well as a society, but it leaves us in a place now where we have an opportunity to co-create, to co-develop, and so. One of the things that I had the good fortune to be involved in at Ford was the announcement of their return into the city of Detroit with the purchase of Michigan Central Station. If you look at that, as some of the journalists did, and I'm not divulging anything proprietary, the journalists observed and said, "Oh, look, here's a company that used to design things behind 12-foot walls and sort of, unleash them upon the community, that now is having this realization of, oh, we will have to design, build, and test with communities, of, by, and for communities. And that's going to require an entirely new set of skills. It's also going to require an entirely different way of thinking about business models. So for a company that, the OEMs right now, including some of the new entrants into the market, they really think about things like models. Like, what's this is the Model 3, or this is the new Explorer. Meanwhile, over at the government that is Uber, they think about miles. And so miles is a radically different business proposition, because I may say I'm going to do 1 mile on your people mover, and I'm going to do 1 mile on a scooter, and I'm going to do the last half mile on my feet. And so I think what we have to do is say, all right, that's rapidly encroaching into the public realm, and how do we create a new, larger construct for business, the people, and then these other two sectors, the nonprofit and the government, to re-engage in ways that have different transparency and different accountability. Now, a lot of folks say, well, that's already, that's B Corp, that's things that are already moving on. I think we've only scratched the superficial surface of corporate purpose, and that we're going to have to get a lot more mechanical and a lot more accountable. If you look at, if I was to look at the top 100 supposedly purpose-oriented companies in America right now, that has nothing to do with the amount of post-tax profits that they're dedicating to what they call their purpose. And so we're going to have to say to everybody that's in my client base, like, is your money where your heart is? Is your money where your mouth is? And are you advancing outcomes that are truly accountable to the consumers that you claim to want to take care of? And what's cool is radical transparency has the ability to drive us further in that direction. You see a lot of companies being financially rewarded because of these better behaviors.
But what, just to sort of bring it to ground level, you know, there's everyone here lives in a community where, I would assume, where Uber is providing a transportation service and collecting great traffic data. Everyone here is living in a community where Airbnb is letting you rent out your house and collecting great information about where people live in properties. Everyone here is living in a community where they're using Instagram to share photos, and Facebook has geolocation data. So what do you do if you're a community foundation or a library or another civic organization that recognizes these changes are happening, to start asking those questions? Practically, what would be the first step in a community to start opening up these dialogues?
I mean, in simplest terms, I think we have to look at data just like we look at dollars. You know, for those of you in the room that are journalists, you know, there's a long-standing tradition of following the dollars and saying, okay, where are companies putting their investments? And companies think about this all the time. Is what's our responsibility of reinvestment? What's our responsibility to shareholders? I regularly engage in deep debates about, you know, shareholder primacy and whether that's, you know, whether the passive shareholder should be the supreme force in corporations, which I don't believe is so. But I think from a community perspective, no matter the size of the company, you've got to ask and hold companies accountable on data just as well as you do on dollars. And what does that mean? I mean, I think that transparency, use, understanding of, you know, we have example of how Facebook is producing a particular use, but I think communities are going to need a lot of choice in that use. They're going to need a lot of access. Institutions are going to need that as well. And I think about this more broadly. You know, when I said early on, like, our humanity immune system is broken. You know, big data is like the humanity endocrine system, and it's going to show us the way to heal our problems over time, and those problems are always evolving. You know, right now we're thinking about climate, and we're thinking about tribalism, and I remember what we were thinking about 20 years ago, and I can only imagine what we're going to think about 20 years in the future. So we have to systemically think about, okay, what are the tools that we're going to need at the ready in order to repetitively adapt. And so data becomes, in large part, the endocrine system to me. And so if I'm at a community level right now, I've always pushed companies on where their money's going, and I'm pushing them really hard on where their data's going and what they're doing with my data.
Paulette, what do you think? I mean, who should own this data? If you're thinking about the local level, if you're in a community, how do you take ownership over what we can learn from this information?
Well, we've had challenges for us with, there's a lot of data available, but part of our challenge is we want to look at specific data, like on African Americans, and that becomes more of a problem to dig into that data. But I was going to say, in a larger, just to kind of talk about the community foundation space, or the civic commons space, like the conversations around data, I think is what we need to be thinking about. And it used to be like with media, you know, kind of looking at the data, telling you what to think about it, analyzing it for you. And I think what we're going to see more of is a collaborative effort and more engagement around within the community around conversations about data. So I think community foundations can play a role in that as kind of a convener. I think especially in places we talk about news deserts. I live in one of those where there aren't a lot of media newspapers, and the newspapers that have been really gutted, so they don't have a lot of reporters. So we have some small startups with nonprofit news sites, but I think that what we'll end up seeing is more of a collaboration with those folks who have access to the information, having conversation in the community about that information. I don't think it's going to belong to any one group.
But you guys are producing a form of community data. Is that the long-term answer, that it's got to be produced in a public, openly accessible way, or is the long-term answer that we're gonna be able to open up the data that others are collecting.
We're analyzing some, we're producing some. I don't know long term what that's gonna look like. I mean, with open data, there's so much out there, but I think part of the problem is even when we're visualizing it, we're talking about mapping it, and this has been one of our challenges. Even mapping it doesn't necessarily tell the story of the data. So in part, what we've started doing was having conversations with researchers around, like, why did they even do this research? Just to talk about the story around it. So I think there's going to be more of that kind of conversation. I think you're going to need journalists, but I think you'll also need folks who are working in the trenches, who are doing that work in the community to also have the conversations. I just don't see it coming from one source.
So Chaya, in many ways, for a company like Facebook, the business is the data. It's the collection of the data in order to serve either advertisements or other kinds of services that are lucrative. You're on the front lines of some of the folks, I think that Josh is pointing to, who are saying, you're collecting all of this. It's valuable. It's valuable to answer a lot of questions. What's Facebook trying to do? Is it enough? What should we expect of companies like Facebook and Google and others in terms of being able to actually make use of this data for things other than serving ads, to be able to understand disease patterns in community, to be able to understand what traffic patterns are in a community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different things I'd like to talk about. One is how we're using data to power our products and tools, and how I've seen community organizations actually leverage those tools for the purposes of community and be able to get value from our data that way. I think second is some of the work that we're doing proactively to actually build out ways to share data externally, but also with a big asterisk that preserving privacy and making sure that the data is in good hands slows us down, and I think at times just makes us think a lot harder before we can get it out the door as fast as we'd like to. And then third, I think it's where there's still a lot of questions, and I think that we need to have more conversations like this and more conversations with the people in this room to understand where as a company we need to go. So on the first side is with products. Obviously, everyone knows that we use lots and lots of data to build the products that we offer to companies. That's how we make money. We make money off of ads. Our advertising tools is actually one interesting platform that I've seen a lot of community organizations leverage the power of our ads tools in order to do good. And so I don't think that just because there's a business purpose for the use of that data in ads, that there's not a purpose for the broader community. A great example of this is a Data for Good product called Insights for Impact. And it's really just branding on our side, but what we did was we realized a lot of NGOs, a lot of community foundations were already using Facebook ads to reach communities with messages that were important to them, be it public service announcements or other types of conversations that they wanted to have. And so instead of recreating a product from scratch or handing the data to those organizations, instead what we did was we allowed them to use the same services that our top ads customers who spend millions on our platform are able to get, which is, one, help understanding conversations about a topic in the media, two, being able to run an ad or serve content to people who are interested in those topics, and then three, being able to understand how well that ad resonated. And in that case, we didn't need to create anything new. The data was already there. We already give the data back to the community through products, and we were just able to help organizations better leverage that technology. The second piece is the proactive work we're doing, which I personally believe we need to do a whole lot more of, and I think that the company is showing that we're kind of moving in that direction. Our Data for Good products, like disaster maps is an example of this. The work that we're doing with a group of academics called Social Science One, which Knight is one of the funders for, in which we are providing Facebook data sets to the academic community so that they can study our impact on elections and democracy. This is another example, and I'm hoping that over the years we can start to build more examples of this. But the asterisk that I put in before was privacy is what's slowing us down here. And one is our commitment that we need to do this the right way from a privacy perspective, and that we can't just give out data in a way that might be abused or might be taken advantage of. And we need to do it with a way that actually protects users and their data in our data sets. And making that investment in privacy is slowing us down, and we're not working fast enough. And I know that it's impacting the journalism community. I know it's impacting the NGO community, and it's definitely impacting the academic community, but we want to get this right. And then the third is, I'm sure a lot of people in this room have ideas on where Facebook should be doing more. And I think that with those ideas, we're very open to hearing them. And we're very committed to listening and understanding how we can kind of get more of those ideas into bucket number 2, where we're able to start to build towards sharing that data, but again, in a way that protects privacy.
We'll open it up to your ideas for what Facebook should be doing in just a few minutes. But first, I'm sure people do have ideas. Yes. Aaron, how do you respond to that? I mean, you made the analogy of that these are the new governments. Well, government data is something that we have claims to. Right. We've been collecting census data for hundreds of years, but that's just one of the many data sets that governments collect. I mean, some of the breakthrough work on mobility in this country is Raj Chetty looking at IRS return data. So if we're reliant on a corporate entity to make decisions about which purposes are good purposes or not, or purposes that follow certain rules of privacy or not, how are we ultimately going to be able to live in an environment in which these are the governments?
Well, I think Josh was very right in that, our operating system that we have as a society is used to dealing with a certain set of categories and a certain set of principles that really aren't necessarily applicable in this new world to a certain extent. And again, I think that a lot of these challenges that we're having, although difficult, are in many ways healthy because they indicate that we're working, we're in the early days. I don't think we should expect it to be super solved. And when you look at a company like Facebook or any of these tech companies, most of them are frankly not that old. They haven't been around that long, and they became gigantic companies very quickly, and therefore they're struggling to build the kind of infrastructure that long-established corporations. Think about a company like IBM. Well, it understands government relations from many years ago, whereas a lot of these other companies are so new that they didn't really, they haven't really built out a lot of the infrastructure that typical corporations would have. I think that's being built. And so I think that we do need to develop this operating system and these rules of the road around how it's going to be in the future. And so I think that means companies like Facebook need to invest in these capabilities that they're building to be able to assist local communities in getting access to the data, and recognizing that there are pieces of data where there is a commercial interest that need to be protected. And then I think I'm just thinking about, again, our audience and some of the community foundations in the media industry, I think a lot of it is, my fear in a lot of this is that the big cities like New York, which have tremendous concentrations of technology talent and a lot of money, are being able to do things in ways that smaller places aren't. Technology industry is very concentrated. So people who are capable of analyzing data and engaging with some of these tech companies aren't necessarily in every community. Particularly the smaller communities you get, the harder it is to find necessarily really great data analysts who could deal with all these companies and then figure out how to report this data. And so I think there probably needs to be some investment in capability development over time. I mean, somebody talked about libraries earlier, some library people here. Libraries were originally private, and then sort of the philanthropies funded the libraries, and it eventually became a government function, but we had to figure out how to do libraries. And now we're having to figure out how to do community engagement with these new types of apps that are really becoming the operating system on which people are living their lives in a lot of respects. And so I think that the community foundations can probably help with that. I think state governments are going to have to step up and play a supporting role in smaller communities as well. So I think there is a lot of investment in capability development, both across the companies and across kind of governments, that allow us to sort of build this out. And then we do have to figure out, again, what are the rules going to look like in the future, which is very uncertain at this point.
Let's open it up in case there are questions in the audience.
Question?
One.
Hi, Candace Wortman from Outlier Media in Detroit. As you're thinking about technology and engaging communities, and you look at cities like the one I live in where 40% of people don't have any access at all to the internet, how do we make sure that we're not leaving people behind? Because if I'm, listening to what's happening on this stage, that means that 40% of Detroit don't have access to the kinds of technology that you're talking about, which means they're going to be left behind in the future, and that is a scary thing to think about when you think about 40% of a city like Detroit being left behind.
Josh, you have lived in Detroit. Do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, so I think there's a big question of the gap between engagement and actual interaction. So looked at the data in Detroit quite a bit. We did a lot of neighborhood work in a number of places. In Cody Rouge, the numbers were worse than that, so more like 60%. And that's where I intersect my two lives. So I've had this one live on the corporate side, trying to help inform big companies how to better pursue their purpose. This other life that started at the neighborhood level and worked its way up. And so, for example, right now, if that question came up at Ford, which it will at some point in Courtown, I would go back to my time in Chattanooga and say, you guys, when we did what at the time was the world's largest community visioning process in Chattanooga, we had 26,000 people take a survey about the future of the community. We started it online and thought that was where we'd get 80% of our interaction. Ended up being absolutely inverse to that. 80% of the points of feedback came in on paper. Most of it was done on clipboards with old school Marshall Gann's organizing techniques, going door to door, block by block. And so I think you have to, it's funny, one of my colleagues, one of my former Knight colleagues was like, why are you on the technology panel, Josh? Because I'm actually much more into the analog than I am the digital. I think you have to know when to use which tool. And so for entities that are looking to engage and not leave folks behind, you need to go back and pick up the tools that are going to appeal to everyone. And then I think we also have to push towards a place where we start to question what is over time, our definition of poverty has changed. And so what was poverty 100 years ago and what's poverty today is very different. I think we have to start questioning things like data and mobility as basic human rights. And if so, I come from Appalachia, there was sweeping rural electrification projects. And so how are we going to approach the things that we're seeing making people become more divergent and invest in them systemically in order to decrease those barriers?
Paulette?
I was just going to add, so I see it as an opportunity. And I come from a community background, so community newspaper I grew up with, community foundation, I sit on a board. So I believe that a lot of our solutions can be found within the community. And we had the same kind of issue in terms of connectivity and technology in our community. And through our project, actually, I started working with nonprofits who work with youth. And I just had a conversation about a week ago with one of the individuals who is the executive director of a nonprofit who works with young girls called Ignite Leadership Academy. She learned about our project through one of our convenings and became extremely excited about the power of GIS. So she incorporated that into her curriculum. It's a Saturday Academy for girls. Well, she started having other ideas. She's not a technologist. She doesn't really have a background in technology. She's actually a retired realtor, but she knows the value, sees the value of it. So what she came to me with is, Paulette, I've had this idea of these tech hubs. And I think what I'd love to do is teach GIS to individuals in the community. And she doesn't do the teaching. She actually has a geo mentor that has volunteered to do the teaching. And we've actually outfitted her with a lot of computers. And she'd been talking to the city about this. She'd been talking to the city about, I want to do these tech hubs. And the city's been kind of dragging their feet on it. And she's like, Paulette, they hear me, but they're really not listening. And I said, look, you have everything you need. You have the computers, you have the idea, you have the geo mentor. Just start doing the tech hubs yourself. And so she's like, okay, I'm launching in March. And she's just going to start. She's going to go through community organizations, and she's going to offer the opportunity for people to learn that technology in different parts of the city. So it's not even going to be in one place, and she's going to do them in different parts of the city. So I think as community leaders that we can solve some of those problems ourselves. We don't have to wait for someone to solve it for us.
I think also there's obviously an important discussion about access to digital services, which requires some sort of internet connection and at this point a mobile device. But there's, to your point, Josh, I think access to the insight that's made available by having systems that are already aggregating the data. And access to the insight can happen by putting up a poster board in a community room that says, here's information about air quality in your neighborhood that we've collected. And I think that is a huge opportunity to Lee's question. What can a library do? A library can provide that access to the insight, even if the digital connectivity isn't in the community. Other
questions?
Yeah. Hong.
Thank you. My name is Hong Q, and I work at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. And I want to tie this back to the Trust Commission recommendation of the 1-year service. If you had hundreds of young people or anyone who's doing 1 year of service work for the community, what would you have them do in these smarter city projects?
Who wants to jump in?
Well, I would just say we've been fortunate. One of our university presidents was part of our original convening, and he offered paid interns to work with some of our organizations. And then from there, we've just had others who are experts in GIS who volunteer their time to work with our organizations. So for us, it's been that. I could see us growing it to people with other skills, but for now, we just started with kind of having these geo mentors who help develop curriculum for our nonprofit organizations.
Chai, does Facebook do any kind of data technical service programs? Like, what are the kinds of things people do that actually have had value?
Yeah, I think the biggest program that this would connect to is we're building a program for community leaders. And so one of Facebook's goals is to give people the power to make the world more open and connected. And as a part of that mission, we have a program where we actually fund community leaders across particularly the US right now, but hopefully globally, who are using Facebook as a platform to build community. And I could see those leaders being connected with our tools and our platforms to be able to spread their message across their communities.
And I think part of it too is asking, like, we have companies like Esri that are really community minded. We have Bournes that has 2 schools of engineering in our region named after them because of the commitment they have to education. And I think part of it is just asking those types of companies too to be partners in this.
So I've got a bit more technical answer because I've had some time to think on this. But, so I'd take your year, and the first 3 months, I would teach these kids that they're part of this humanity immune system, and train them as living leukocytes. So how to be.
You're getting a lot of mileage out of this metaphor.
Yeah, no, this is what I obsess on right now, and they're living leukocytes, which I think is something that can be trained as a discipline. I think they need to know the GAN's organizing techniques. I think they need to know GIS. I think they need to know door-to-door activism and how that works. I think they need to know the history of change. I think they need to have some sense of what is the humanity operating system and how they might impact it systemically. And so I would take them from here, and then the next 9 months, I would put them in something called Place Core, and I would put them in a neighborhood and let them attempt to become the change they wish to see there alongside of a community. Because I see all of my friends who have gone to Peace Corps and they've gone to other countries, and I got sent to, or I went to, asked to go to Akron for night, and I was like, why is everybody going to Africa when they, one, don't have any business being there because they don't truly understand it, they're not of, by, and for the place, and also when Akron needs them right here at home. And so I think like, if you could instill in kids very early on that no matter where they're going to go work, be it government, nonprofit, for-profit, that they are to be living leukocytes, like the part of your life responsibility is to leave the world better than you found it, that could have profound impact on where we end up.
Did we have another question?
Hi, I'm Tim Marima. I edit a website called The Daily Yonder, which covers rural America. And so there's 55 million rural Americans, depending on how you count them. Broadband access is less. There was a statement made that we have, every place has these apps that they use that don't. Currently, I can get Uber from the airport, but not to the airport. And I'm the lucky one, right? So I appreciate the comments, especially about investing in capacity building within these communities and within with the technology that is just not there yet. But I feel like we're having a conversation where 20% of the U.S. and we can point, and the disturbing statistic out of Detroit too, that this is not an even conversation. Our society in the past has had a mechanism through things like the Universal Service Fund to say we need to level the playing field, we need to pay attention to access. So I would just, are there other ideas about how to level this playing field? Because I think it's very important and needs more attention.
Yeah, can I answer
Yeah,
that one?
yeah.
Well, I actually grew up in a rural area. I grew up 4 miles outside of a town of 29 people. The house I grew up in does not have broadband access. So you can only get dial-up internet, which is so useless that my mother dropped it. And we basically barely have any cell service. Maybe you get 1 bar of cell service. So certainly, from a hard infrastructure perspective, I think we're going to have to make some investments in just providing access to networks. I think wireless is probably much more important than wireline in a lot of ways. We're moving to the mobile phone now for things. We're getting away from the kind of desktop computing. So I think that through that, not to say we shouldn't have fiber optics everywhere. My county is now installing it. But I would prioritize the wireless, which has allowed a lot of developing world countries to essentially leapfrog the capabilities we have here in many ways. But I think we also have to just say a lot of things like, as long as we have cars that require drivers, there may not be Uber service available in your community, but maybe once we have a driverless Ford car, there will be. Rural mobility, I think some of these technologies, if we get driverless cars, rural mobility is going to be an enormous beneficiary of something like that because most rural areas, if they have any public transit, it's essentially sort of just an essential service shuttle sort of thing. And so I think that ultimately, it's like a lot of things, you get things later in the country. When I grew up, we still had a party line telephone, and now we can have a private line. And so I think that we have...
Wow.
They installed water service. So I think we will install the infrastructure. I think it's going to be on a lag realistically because that's essentially how it's always worked with every infrastructure we've deployed. But I do think a lot of these technologies have tremendous, tremendous benefits for rural areas. I mean, again, when I was a kid, we had 3 over-the-air TV stations. Today, once you have internet, you have the world. You have songs that you could only get at the exclusive record stores in the big cities that most cities didn't even have access to, these libraries of foreign films. And so what's available now, once we have an internet connection through the basic infrastructure, I think is transformational for rural America. But we're still gonna have to make some investments in that.
I do think also, first of all, I hope the townies in the town of 29 didn't make you feel like that much of an outsider, living 4 miles outside. But we tend to think a lot, it seems to me, a lot of the time of these services in terms of what they do for us now. But the rural example, one of the largest sort of digital data collection projects happening right now is in agribusiness, and because of the economic pressures of the business. And I think there are great questions that we can be asking in farming-dependent communities about what that data can be doing for people who aren't in agribusiness. That's great data about what's happening environmentally in a community. That's great data about what's happening in terms of other indicators in a community as well. So by way of closing, I'd love to have you each answer Lee's question from the last panel, which is sort of, if you were running a library system, what would you do when it comes to these questions of really taking advantage of the technology that's making community smarter? Can we start with you, Josh?
Yeah, I think starting from a question of what do you think the library is for? Because not a lot of administrators at this point, but still a lot of citizens think of libraries as repositories of information and not places for access of information, places of the collection and collision of ideas. And so redefining the imagination collectively of what a library is. And then once you do that, you dramatically change what your programming offering would be. And so, as interestingly, during my time in Detroit, you see people corralling around overhangs around some libraries and around some closed restaurants because there's a router inside, and that's where the one place they can get access to a little bit of data. I do think we'll look at data like we look at water at some point as a human right. But I would think of my library as a router and as a hub of where information can be found and where true information can be found, much to the notion of a lot of things that have been discussed today. And then as an accelerator of community progress, because it is, so many places are no longer neutral, but the library remains a place of neutrality, a true point of civic commons.
What would you do, Paulette?
I would add to that the idea of the hub for the library. If I were the library, I would look to my community foundation, find out how we could partner, looking at any donor-advised funds that support libraries. And maybe bring those donors in even and convene those with media to look at the information needs of the community and how they could all work together, kind of collaborate together to address those needs in their specific community.
Aaron?
Yeah, when I was spent the summer in Bloomington, Indiana, where I went to school, and went to the public library there, and I walked through the local kind of reference section. And one of the things I saw on the shelf were telephone books, all the old telephone books from years and years and years and years, and all the old yellow pages. And I just think about all the research that we can do into the past because we had hard copy records, whether it be the physical computer, the physical newspaper that's now a microfiche, but it could be just a phone book, an ability to find out what businesses were around. There was a lot of research that was great. A guy named Eric Fisher did it into rents in San Francisco that he got from digitizing the classified ads in the San Francisco Chronicle from like decades and decades ago. And so I think how to solve for this lack, when somebody goes to do research on the present, what are they going to find when so much of the data is ephemeral, it's digital and it's ephemeral, And so there are digital archiving projects. I presume there's a lot of people in the library field already looking about this, but creating an archive of data about your community from these digital original sources so that future researchers can actually find out what was going on, I think is something I would be looking into.
Troy?
I would say two things. One is putting on my hat as a member of the board of a local foundation that tries to work with schools, is just building a place where different people across generations of a community can come together and figure out how to impact their community through built environment or repairing spaces or just building a hub for people to come together and talk about the world that they live in. And then second is then empowering those people with just an understanding of how to leverage data to solve the problems in their community. Not that data is kind of the ends to all means, but more so that they could really figure out problems in their community, use data to actually come up with solutions and advocate for solutions to those problems.
Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.